So here we're back for the second session of the Artist Strategies in Renaissance Italy. And after a stimulating first session, we're ready to start the second, which is entitled Artists in Motion Within and Toward Renaissance Italy. I'm Jonathan Nelson from Syracuse University in Florence. But what you want to hear about is not the chair, but the first speaker. This is Max Hernandez. And I want to say that one of the things that's so lovely about conferences here at NIKI is not only the interesting topics that are chosen, but very often, and indeed in this very session, there's a range of speakers. So the three speakers in this session come from three different continents and are at different stages at their career. So the first speaker is a graduate student finishing up soon, I assume, since to judge from how much he's achieved thus far. So although Max is still a graduate student of Stephen Campbell, studying at Johns Hopkins University, he already has at least one important publication that I know of under his belt this morning. Part of the job of the chair. I had the pleasure of reading a great article that he wrote very recently, identifying new fresco fragments that are part of Castagno's Pazzi Madonna, and giving discussing the setting for that. But normally he works on sculpture. He'll be giving another talk. I'll have to talk about another institution here in town next Thursday, I believe. Medici Archive Project is having a conference, and he's speaking about a women artist, and we speak about a woman sculptor there. But today, excuse me, he'll be speaking about a topic which is very close to the subject of his own dissertation. So he'll be looking at the mobility of modelers, considerations on the artistic geographies of North Italian clay sculpture in the Quattrocento. Next. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, Takuma, for the invitation. Thank you to the Dutch Institute for hosting. And I'll get right into it because I'm at 24 minutes, so right within time. Miser Gasparo, dopo lunga via di Genova, di Nizza e di Saona, ed Alba, d'Asti, ed Aiqui, e di Tortona, e di quanti castelli han signoria, son dei Grazia pur giunto a Pavia, benché arrostito son della persona. Verrei che in borsa un sol quattrin non suona, tant'è là de moneta carestia. Il mio mantel de zofami le frappe, pensa po' quel che fanno i borzacchini, che sen van per dispetto a giappe. Del cavallo so che tutte l'indivini, senza che io il dica, il mostra altro che rappe, e a carghe le spalle dei rubini. Sì, che da malandrini non so se io tema, e vo pur là, pian piano, doman o l'altra, giornierò a Milano. Ringing with Dantesque rhymes and terms, these verses recount a trip taken on horseback, which probably lasted only a few weeks at most. In the tight sequence of localities, we get a sense of the quick rhythm of the writer, along the Ligurian coast, up into Piedmont, and then up into the heartland of the Duchy of Milan, by then at a slower pace. Perhaps we should not consider the image of the poet with tattered clothes, which is typical in burlesque poetry of the early Quattrocento, as a simple topos, but one put to good use in evoking the difficulties of travel. The sonnet touches on many of the harsh realities of pre-modern mobility: skin roasted in the sun, slim wages, worn, soiled clothes, and broken boots. Even the horse is physically devastated, with bleeding injuries compared to rubies. Finally, of course, the fear of bandits. Days on the road could run one ragged. As art historians concerned with mobility, we should lend even more attention to this Quattrocento poem, considering its author, the great painter turned architect Donato Bramante of Urbino. Likely in Liguria to inspect structures for Ludovico il Moro in 1488, Bramante's trip presumably did not follow the order of the verses, constrained by rhyme and metric. But it can be tentatively reconstructed as shown on this map, which reflects the geopolitical configuration of the Italian peninsula after the signing of the Treaties of Lodi in 1454. And note that Nizza is probably not the city on the coast, but Nizza Monferrato in Piemonte. As we can see, Bramante crossed into different states at least 5 times, if not more. In his poem, he states this clearly, albeit in hyperbole. He visits as many walled cities as have geopolitical districts. Lunga via di quanti castelli han signoria. It is the crossing of the geopolitical threshold which I think best defines what constitutes a traveling artist in pre-modern Italy, and which is the quality of mobility which I will focus on most today. Breaking with dominant narratives of mobility in the Italian Renaissance, which have focused primarily on painters, I will talk about the mobility of sculptors, and in particular of those specialized in a specific medium, unglazed terracotta. This means artists who, in their manipulation of clay, experimented with its affordances in the depiction of human expression to achieve poignant realism or a more expressionistic character. So not the Della Robbia, whose shiny classicizing figures reached an impressive geographic range thanks to Florentine mercantile routes rather than artists' travels. The artists I consider today cross borders themselves. Their careers were characterized by frequent and sometimes relentless mobility, and this at a crucial moment in the history of their medium, and across a period of greater change in the Italian peninsula, the transition from the relatively stable decades after the Peace of Lodi into the chaos and disaster of the Italian wars. I will discuss the careers of three terracottari, as they are called in Italian, as case studies reflecting different conditions of the mobility of modelers. To do so, I will consider locations of works and objects, but I will also focus heavily on documents illustrating the realities of making and moving. So there will be some slides with lots of words, I'm sorry. There has yet to be a serious reflection on the geography of Northern Italian clay sculpture of the Quattrocento, despite very important research of the past decade by scholars such as Aldo Galli and Marco Scansani. I'm not interested in determining a zone of autochthony for the medium, as historiography has done unsuccessfully for over a century, but to look simply at how far it reached and its reception, and fortuna, to use an Italian term. For example, a region almost completely devoid of Quattrocento terracotta is the Ligurian coastline, i.e. the sphere of influence of the Genoese Republic. When the Del Carretto family looked for all'antica decoration of the palace from which they ruled fino al Borgo, they looked not to Tuscany, as they did for their painters, but north, calling the artists who were active decorating palaces and churches in Cardinal Branda's transformed Castiglione Olona, where some of the earliest independent terracotta sculptures of the Renaissance were made by the so-called Caronesi, sculptors from Lombardy. Before looking at the three case studies, it is worth remembering as a preamble how the mobility of one artist in the first half of the Quattrocento was decisive in setting the stage for the spread of terracotta sculpture across a broad region of northern and central Italy. The peripatetic Michele da Firenze, who has been well studied by Aldo Galli, trained with Lorenzo Ghiberti, but was in Ferrara in 1427. Back in Tuscany, but Arezzo in 1431, then to Verona in the Venetian Republic, then again to the Este lands, around which he moved constantly for about 10 years, before moving to yet another state, the Sforza stronghold of Pesaro, where he ended his days. Although we might be tempted to see in this mobility the ambition of a groundbreaking artist working in a new medium, the truth is far more mundane. Michele was running from debt, which he contracted nearly everywhere he went. My first case study, Sperandio Savelli, is best known as the most prolific metal maker of the Quattrocento, but he was also a prolific maker of terracotta sculptures. Born in Mantua to a Roman goldsmith named Bartolomeo Savelli, Sperandio likely began his career with his father, who worked for the Gonzaga, the Este, and the Sforza. Sperandio was thus, from the beginning of his time as an artist, inserted into courtly networks. And the majority of documents on his early years are letters between monarchs of Italian states. Despite his Mantuan origins in Ferrarese training, the earliest known mention and works of Sperandio, as recently discussed by Marco Scansani, are to be found in the Duchy of Milan. The Virgin on the left here was made in the early 1460s for a church that Sperandio might have possibly designed, and which was commissioned by the Sforza. It's a church at Bressanoro near Cremona. Yet in 1466, Sperandio was already back in Ferrara working for Borso d'Este. During his time with the Este, it is likely that he could have moved around their polycentric state. Two published documents that have not yet been interpreted as evidence of such mobility are payments for the ferrying of the wife of Sperandio from Ferrara through Finale and to Modena. She was traveling with 4 people. And you can see that in the document in Latin. Since Sperandio and Maria, his wife, had 4 children, we might assume that the artist's family was reaching him to live for a period in the other Este capital. The lack of documents for Savelli in the years following does not support or disprove this hypothesis. The documents even specify the type of craft which Giovanni Castro, the helmsman, would have guided, a 2-oared boat. It is likely that this form of travel was selected for its speed, and the Duke's agent specified that they were to hurry sine mora, without stops. At Borso's death, Sperandio wrote a letter to his successor, Ercole, to seek his favor and more commissions. In it, we get a sense of his ambition as an artist, and I quote, "I don't want to live in this world if not following my weak intelligence and ingenuity." But Sperandio also expresses his readiness to relocate in order to prove himself, a disposition that he uses for leverage with his new patron. And I quote, "It pains me to my heart to have to search for other lands if your lordship does not help, because I have decided and established to live and die under the shadow of your excellency." Perhaps Sperandio was not satisfied with Ercole's patronage when he began fraternizing with the lord of Faenza, Carlo Manfredi. In May of 1476, Carlo wrote to Ercole to request that he send Sperandio for 8 or 10 days. 1 year later, Manfredi wrote again. This time, he asked that Ercole send Sperandio to make sculptures for the cathedral and to serve him. He even specifies that Sperandio had professed that he was well disposed to do this. A letter of only a few weeks later reveals that Sperandio was already in Faenza, likely satisfied by Manfredi's economic conditions. But he had not yet moved house. Carlo therefore requested that Ercole allow his servant to gather the artist's things and that they be allowed to cross the border without duties, senza alcun pagamento de dazio. Thus emerges another difficulty for traveling artists. Even the transportation of their own belongings, no doubt including workshop materials, was subject to tax. The remarkable contract stipulated between the Manfredi family and Sperandio survives. It shows that terracotta sculptures were among the objects that were expected of the artist, who was presented as something of an all-rounder. But among the other conditions for work and payment, there is also the stipulation that Sperandio be required to travel by horse throughout the state, and not beyond, et non più in là. Here, the mobility of an artist was regulated by contract, and maybe Carlo was worried that Sperandio would negotiate with other lords the way that he had done with him, to move away from Faenza and up in the world. But Sperandio's fortunes were short-lived. Within a year of his arrival, in a coup d'etat, Carlo Manfredi was deposed, and Sperandio was forced to relocate. Further suggesting his dissatisfaction with treatment by Ercole, he chose not to return to Ferrara. He went to Bologna. In a letter from Giovanni Bentivoglio to Lorenzo the Magnificent here in Florence, we see the actual conditions of the artist's dire situation. He lost over 100 ducats worth of possessions, and considering the circumstances, this probably means that he lost his work materials. The very next day, we find Sperandio doing something that many of us have probably had to do as part of our own migrations. He went to the immigration office, the Ufficio delle Presentazioni dei Forestieri. Here, it is made clear that Sperandio intended to relocate to Bologna, but we also get a better sense of the familial dynamics of his mobility. Savelli was with his wife, 3 daughters, a son, and 2 servants. In Bologna, Sperandio's most notable works are in terracotta, including the facade of the monastery church of the Corpus Domini and the only papal tomb in terracotta, that of Alexander V. He certainly had collaborators, and although it is impossible to determine based on their own documents, it is likely, considering the dynamics of late medieval workshops, that some were members of his family, or even possibly his servants, Bartolomeo and Ambrogio. Sperandio spent over 10 years in Bologna, but he did not stop moving to seek better patronage. In summer 1491, the Duke of Ferrara paid duties on Sperandio's work goods and tools entering Ferrara. Despite documents suggesting a good rapport with Ercole, Sperandio left Ferrara for Padova. in the Venetian Republic after less than 3 years, moving house completely with over 700 pounds of goods. Again, the duties were covered by Duke Ercole. The following year, Sperandio sought the favor of Francesco Gonzaga, so the Marquis of Mantua, through the good auspices of his brother, Cardinal Ludovico. A letter reveals that Sperandio claimed Mantua as his homeland and that he wanted to die there. Interestingly, he no longer presented himself as a sculptor, but as an expert in artillery and an architect. Perhaps the French invasion of the Italian peninsula in 1494 gave him the chance to reinvent himself. If so, he took it. Sperandio would not die in the city on the river, but in the city on the lagoon, Venice, spending the last 10 years of his life as a bombardiere, without any evidence of having made even a single terracotta in the Maritime Republic. A modeler with completely different dynamics of mobility was the great Agostino de Fondulis. Agostino was the son of Giovanni de Fondulis and the grandson of the mysterious goldsmith Fondulino de Fondulis. The family hailed from Crema, but Giovanni's career led him to Padua, where he worked most of his life. It's important to remember that although now in the Italian geo-administrative region of Lombardia, Crema was part of the Venetian Republic from 1449 to 1796, with only a minor interruption between 1509 and 1512. As a boy, Agostino likely followed his father, who had worked in Padua, in the Veneto, in Crema, but also in the Duchy of Milan, at Pavia, and it is in the Milan of Ludovico Sforza that Agostino is first recorded. Anyone who's grown up between different countries will be able to understand the legitimate confusion of the first documents that mention him. In 1482, he is called De Padua, but in 1483, in the contract for Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks, he is called De Crema and a civis Milanensis, so a citizen of Milan. This suggests that he had been in the city for some time. His first known works there are in fact of the utmost prestige. In March 1483, he was commissioned to finish a lamentation that he had already begun for the altar of the Church of San Satiro and to decorate the sacristy of Santa Maria presso San Satiro, with Donato Bramante himself as the evaluator of the works upon their completion. Most of the sculptures were freely modeled, but De Fondulis used molds for the upper frieze. In that moment, Agostino was one of the foremost sculptors in the duchy, and the reasons for his mobility within the microstate prove it. Various members of Il Moro's court had their palaces in their hometowns refurbished in the 1480s and 1490s, and Agostino worked together with his father-in-law, Giovanni Battaggio, on many of them. The decoration, which often added to pre-existing structures, to give them new architectural harmony, included freely modeled heads, but also friezes made using molds. If Agostino and Giovanni were working on site, as is documented, for Palazzo Landi in Piacenza and for some church projects, then we have to imagine that the artists would have had to travel and bring their molds with them. Documents show that Agostino began working in his family's hometown in the 1490s, and he seems to have been going back and forth between Milan and Crema. In this regard, an interesting case is the commission, only partially published, for Agostino's work on the Church of the Incoronata in Lodi. That city was in the Duchy of Milan, yet the contract specifies the artist was supposed to make 16 heads in a saint, either Saint Sebastian or a Saint Bassiano, which is the patron of Lodi, within the district of Crema, that is, within the Republic of Venice. Should we assume that he then had to cross a border to arrive in Lodi, presumably paying duties? The busts are still in place, but the figure of the saint is lost. But if it was a Sebastian, perhaps not completely. An unpublished bust in Budapest's Museum of Fine Arts, where it is called a work of the 17th century, can only have been made by Agostino de Fondulis. Its stylistic similarities with Agostino's securely documented works are, I believe, undisputable. It even resembles the heads made in a mold for the frieze of San Satiro. The cut of the bust makes it clear that it could not have been for a roundel of a palazzo or a church. Although it is worth entertaining the idea that the head was for Lodi, I think that its style is best placed in the 1480s, closer to Agostino's more expressionistic works, following in his father's footsteps. And I recently brought this bust to the attention of Francesco Galli, a friend who's a scholar of Lombard art, who agreed with both the attribution and the dating, and he will present further discoveries on the head in a forthcoming article. Agostino is documented in Milan and in Crema continuously throughout the 1490s, and he appears in Milan even during the turbulent period after the fall of Ludovico il Moro in 1499. His last known commission in the city for 10 apostles for the drum of the dome of Santa Maria presso San Celso, in this, the document for this commission, he still had a Milanese residence in the parish of San Nazario in Broglio. But this is the last known document concerning his Milanese activity, and we can assume, based on his well-documented later activity, that he chose to remain in Crema, working locally, albeit sometimes just across the border in Milanese territory. For Agostino, mobility seems to have been predicated on his cultivation of two main types of patrons: members of the Milanese court, which he seems to have abandoned after 1499, and institutions, both lay and religious, in and around the Venetian enclave of Crema. The result was a back and forth between the Duchy of Milan and Crema, until the wars ravaging Italy brought to the spectacular collapse of the Milanese state. The third and final modeler, which I will discuss today, is perhaps the most accomplished terracotta artist of the Quattrocento, Guido Mazzoni. Born around 1450 and raised in Modena, some of Mazzoni's first known commissions were for microstates nearby: a lamentation for the church of Santa Maria degli Angeli in the capital of the Pallavicino's feudal possessions, Busseto, and the large-scale Madonna and Child for Guastalla, which was ruled by the Torelli family. Guido was soon integrated into the Este court, for which he and his wife, Pellegrina degli Agazzi, worked assiduously around 1480. From there, Guido Mazzoni gained major interregional commissions. Between 1485 and 1489, he made a large, now heavily damaged, lamentation for Sant'Antonio di Castello in Venice, which became one of the most famous sculptural groups in the lagoon. And in 1489, he was sent to Naples as part of that same network binding that kingdom to the northern Italian courts, through which many artists had passed before him: Pisanello, Costanzo de Moisis, just to cite two. In Naples, Guido worked at the court of King Ferrante and that of Alfonso, the Duke of Calabria, making his famous lamentation for Monte Oliveto. By 1494, Mazzoni was the most traveled of the modelers considered thus far. But the same events which likely pushed Sperandino into ballistics and Agostino de Fondulis to abandon Milan would also upend the lives of Guido and Pellegrina. In that year, Charles VIII of France swept through Italy to take the Kingdom of Naples. Although his military campaign was something of a failure, Charles did not return to France empty-handed. He took Mazzoni with him to Paris, where Guido would make the monarch's tomb, unfortunately destroyed in the French Revolution, for the Abbé de Saint-Denis. In 1496, Mazzoni was made a hereditary knight, and he was kept in the service of the next king, Louis XII, until the latter's death in 1516, when Guido finally returned to his hometown, Modena. The French court was itinerant, so Guido certainly traveled within France. But as far as we know, he was only in Paris, Normandy, and the Loire at Blois. The only surviving terracotta sculptures made by Mazzoni north of the Alps, 3 children, of which one is in the English royal collections, raise the question of Guido's possible travel to England. The Laughing Boy in Green was documented in Britain as early as the 1600s, if not earlier, that Mazzoni designed the first project for the tomb of England's King Henry VII has been known for centuries, but that he had crossed the channel is by no means a given in literature on the artist. And even very recently, in a book that Takuma mentioned earlier, his English sojourn has been contested. Yet two hardly discussed payments, published as early as 1975, make clear that Guido collected small sums for a mock-up and the painting of the design of the tomb monument. There is no mention of someone collecting the payments for him, so in all likelihood, he was there to receive them in person. One of the only French documents mentioning his activity as an artist places him under the patronage of Georges d'Amboise at Gaillon Castle, where he supplied marble decorations. However, a contemporary source ignored in literature on the artist suggests that he might have done more. Writing to Isabella d'Este in 1509, Jacopo Probo d'Atri described the castle and spoke of a covered loggia with statues in terracotta, and I quote, de naturale, unquote, depicting Charles VIII, Louis XII, Anne of Brittany, Georges d'Amboise, and other members of the royal retinue. Considering Mazzoni's specialization in terracotta sculpture, it is hard to believe that he would have abandoned the practice completely once in France. Yet Guido's importance for clay sculpture north of the Alps is still underestimated and mostly undiscussed. There are hardly any terracotta portraits in those regions predating Mazzoni's arrival there. But it is in parallel to his time in France that the earliest known sculptures of this type began to appear at the courts where he was active, that of the Valois and that of the Tudors. The type of meticulous labor poured over details like a web of wrinkles around an eye or the spongy texture of a leathery vest are more typical of Mazzoni's hyperrealism than to anything seen in contemporary Tuscan modelers. So I'm thinking of Torrigiano. Guido Mazzoni ended his days in September 1518, after only 2 years in his native Modena, where he basked in his title and his fame, both of which he owed to his prior mobility. He even seems to have held on to some of the items from his time as an itinerant court artist. In his unpublished post-mortem inventory, there is a luxurious lettuccio da campo, a field bed used for traveling, a barroccio, a two-wheeled cart used for travelers and their supplies, likely something similar to the carretta pellegrina illustrated by Jean Pellerin, and means of transportation, an old gray horse and a mule or a donkey. Not to end with Guido Mazzoni's ass, the animal, of course, I will conclude with some very brief remarks. There may not be a way to sum up what I have discussed today, but I think that a few filons rouges emerge. For example, that the social history of art and the artist must be fully integrated in discussion of mobility, that artists had varying degrees of agency over their own mobility, that conflict as much as commerce was a driver of movement, and that to do justice to the history of Northern Italian art, we should dramatize the years around 1495 more similarly to the events of the sack of Rome, and following a narrative more dominant with historians right now, speak of Northern Italy from around 1495 into the Cinquecento as a shatter zone. At the very least, I hope that this research can speak to a wider fascination and appreciation of in the late Quattrocento for the medium of terracotta and the artistic ability that it required. This, before the hierarchy of media formulated and cemented into canon by Vasari, would eclipse the sculptures which these artists disseminated across Italy and Europe through their travels. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Max. I'm dizzy from all that travel. It's very rich travel indeed. Our next speaker is Paula Nuttal, and she is an independent scholar specializing in artistic relations between Italy and Northern Europe. She's a leading scholar. I should revise what I just wrote down here. She's a leading scholar in this. So a number of us have been talking about this topic, about North and South relations, and now we have the privilege of hearing Paula herself address this issue. Her research has found its way into numerous articles and books, most famously, at least for me, From Flanders to Florence, The Impact of Netherlandish Painting, from 1400 to 1500, which came out 20 years ago, and she's created several exhibitions on this topic. And most recently, speaking about Italy and the North, she published an article in a very recent Burlington on the Bruges Madonna, and currently she's working on Florentine drawing. Today, she's going to speak to us about, let me get her slide up, there you are, about Justus van Ghent, the liberal arts, and the Urbino workshop. Well,
thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. Thank you, Takuma, for organising this wonderful conference and for inviting me to speak at it. And it's lovely to be back at the NIKI again. Thank you, NIKI, as well. Yes, like Max, I need to be brisk. So without further ado, let us launch straight into Justus of Ghent. Justus of Ghent is the most important Netherlandish painter known to have worked in 15th century Italy. He is identified with the Ghent painter Jos van Wassenhove, an associate of Hugo van der Goes, last documented at Ghent in 1468, who in 1475 was said to have gone to Rome some years earlier. Giusto di Guanto, as he is known in Italian, is documented in payments of 1473 to 4 by the confraternity of Corpus Domini at Urbino for their altarpiece of the Communion of the Apostles, now in the Galleria Nazionale delle Marche, and in 1475 for a banner that he did not complete, after which date he vanishes from the documentary record. He's presumably the unnamed eminent master, Maestro Solenne, mentioned by Vespasiano da Bisticci in his life of Federico da Montefeltro, written between 1482 to 98, summoned from Flanders by the Duke, who, I quote, could not find in Italy suitable masters who knew how to paint in oil on panel, end quote. According to Vespasiano, he painted the famous man in the studiolo of the Ducal Palace, probably completed in 1476 and now divided between Urbino and the Louvre, and a portrait of the Duke, perhaps the double portrait of Federico and his son Guidobaldo, which was probably displayed above the entrance to the studiolo. Related to these is the undocumented series of the liberal arts, of which only 2 panels, Music and Rhetoric, survive in the National Gallery, London. 2 others, formerly in Berlin, were destroyed in the Second World War, but are known from photographs. The others are unrecorded. These, together with Federico and Guidobaldo listening to a discourse at Hampton Court Palace, probably decorated the studiolo at Federico's Palace of Gubbio, as recent scholarship by Laura Tesa and Machteld Israels has, I think, reaffirmed quite solidly. Little is known about Justus, who disappears, as I have said, from the record after that final payment to him by the Corpus Domini in November 1475, leading to the assumption, by no means certain, that he had died. His oeuvre is notoriously problematic. Not large, it is universally in severely compromised condition. Just to give you an idea, this painting was discovered in a villa outside Florence in the mid-19th century, where its owners were about to chop it up and make it into a dining table. And it was outside at the time that it was found. Furthermore, apart from their terrible condition, furthermore, over the past 100 years, Justus's authorship of every work once attributed to him has been questioned, contested, and in many cases denied, even those that are documented or authenticated by early sources, an issue that has come to divide the scholarship, sometimes bitterly. Although it is beyond the scope of this paper to rehearse in detail the arguments which have been exhaustively debated elsewhere, it is important to outline the essentials. In 1927, Italian and Spanish scholars proposed that the works traditionally attributed to Justus were in fact by the Castilian painter Pedro Berruguete, a suggestion that met with widespread acceptance and continues to be widely accepted. Seeing elements in Berruguete's later Castilian work that suggested knowledge of the famous man and Urbinate visual culture, it was claimed that he had worked at Urbino in his youth, taking over from Justus of Ghent. The restoration of the famous man at the Louvre in 1988, which found that many of the panels had been extensively reworked by a second painter, appeared to confirm this. In 2001, a document was discovered confirming that a painter called Petrus Spaniolus was resident in Urbino in 1477. Whether this painter was Pedro Berruguete, however, is uncertain. Berruguete's early career is completely unknown, and he is first recorded at Toledo in 1488. His few documented works are entirely different to the Urbino paintings in technique, as recent scientific analysis has shown. And apart from the Old Testament kings and prophets from the retable of Santa Eulalia at Paredes de Nava of around 1490, his surviving or known works bear no relation to other works he is supposed to have painted in Urbino. The painter Petrus, itself a common name, may not even have been Spanish, as Spaniolo is also an Italian surname. And there, I'm afraid we have to leave the Berruguete debate, because that is not what this paper is about. Nevertheless, this debate has become a distraction from other equally pertinent questions. What, for instance, might have been the impact of an experienced Netherlandish painter working in a small but culturally significant centre in 15th century Italy, a phenomenon unique to Urbino? How might his workshop have operated and adapted to local practices? There is no reason to disbelieve Vespasiano's statement that Federico da Montefeltro desired a painter who could produce works in the Netherlandish oil medium, then very much in vogue amongst the Italian elite, and indeed, as we heard this morning, being explored by Italian artists. And this, of course, is including at Urbino, where Federico's half-brother Ottaviano della Carda owned Jan van Eyck's celebrated Women Bathing, now, alas, lost. Justus's first works at Urbino, the Communion, and those of the famous men that were not reworked, such as Cardinal Bessarion, are painted in a technique typical of Netherlandish practice, using a mostly simple layer structure over a thin oil-browned priming. Different oils for particular colours and layers, and additionally, the paint itself is applied using a smoothly blended, imperceptible brushwork. By contrast, the paintings in what can be called the second Justus group, which I've put on the screen now, are executed somewhat differently. The Impressionism paint applied quickly and gesturally, with little evidence of a complicated layer structure. The brushstrokes are visible rather than imperceptibly blended, and the paint is often thick and impasto. There are also differences in style. I'm so sorry, there are differences in the style of the draperies, with typically Netherlandish hook-ended folds in the first group and softer sweeping folds in the second. The second group is also more monumental and volumetric in the conceptualization of figures and employs ambitious di sotto in su perspective viewpoints, unlike the Communion, which is viewed from above. All the paintings have extensive cracks and islands where the paint has contracted, perhaps caused by allowing insufficient drying time between layers, or by applying paint thickly, or by inexpertly prepared oils. This suggests a workshop constrained by the requirements of producing large-scale works, and these are big works, producing large-scale works at speed, and a lack of expertise on the part of assistants unfamiliar with the Netherlandish methods for the preparation of oils and the application of colour. These works nevertheless reveal a sophisticated understanding of the oil technique, evident from the different types of oil used in preparing the paints. For instance, in music, untreated linseed oil was used for the, I'm so sorry, I don't seem to have music on the screen, but you'll see it again in a moment. Untreated linseed oil was used for the, I'm so sorry, maybe I've got it on the previous slide. No, I've lost it. Trust me, it will pop up. Oh, here she is. Okay. Untreated linseed oil for the opaque green paint of the textile on the steps, and heat-bodied linseed oil, which dries more quickly, for the green glazes of that textile on the steps. Walnut oil, which is less yellowing than linseed, was used for the man's white sleeve. The distinctly Netherlandish technique of adding powdered glass to enhance the handling and drying properties of oil paint is found both in the Communion of the Apostles and in music. And may be found in other paintings from this group. We just don't know. In the discourse, the portrait of Guido Baldo is painted on a metal support, a foil support, glued to the panel, a technique not unusual in the Netherlands for portraits which were part of larger compositions, but unique in a painting produced outside the Netherlands. It is possible that Justus's technique evolved in new directions in response to the particular circumstances of working at Urbino. The differences between the two groups are, however, usually taken to mean that the second group is by a different artist, generally assumed to be Paul Goethe. The undeniably Italianate characteristics of this group, notably the approach to space and perspective and the figure style, led some scholars to suggest the additional presence of a third man, an Italian artist for whom various identities were proposed, notably Melozzo da Forlì, Donato Bramante, and Giovanni Santi, none of them convincing. Moving forwards, rather than thinking in terms of individual personalities and successive hands, it might be helpful to envisage a more collaborative model. The gestural brushwork and viscous paint in the London panels and in the Urbino double portrait, all surely by the same artist, is strikingly reminiscent of early experiments in oil painting by Italian artists, such as Piero Pollaiolo. And I show you here just a detail from the Pollaiolo Berlin Annunciation and details from the double portrait in Urbino. I'm not suggesting that the double portrait is by Piero Pollaiolo, however, I'm just trying to evoke this kind of, very sort of viscous, impasto-rich kind of technique that some artists were exploring at this time in Italy, or indeed Giovanni Bellini. In the detail here, obviously from the Barbarigo, Virgin and Child, thinking particularly about the handling of jewels, in this instance, the handling of drapery folds, or indeed here, approaches to the painting of the brocade in the detail from the Doge Loredan and the National Gallery. These artists are like the Justus second group, are often also working rapidly, failing to allow sufficient drying time between layers and exploiting the handling properties of the medium and the ability to render gleaming or shimmering surfaces. It must be stressed that the London panels of the liberal arts have been extensively retouched. And although there seems to be much original paint underneath the retouching, without new scientific investigation, our understanding of them is necessarily limited. It must also be borne in mind that the Berlin panels can be judged only from old photographs, and the other three are completely unknown. It is, however, likely, given the scale of the project, that several workshop members were involved in their production, and that at least some of them were Italian. The liberal arts was surely conceived as an ambitious, state-of-the-art project, a unified room decoration showcasing what, for Federico, was the best of two worlds, blending the rich tonal and lustrous effects of Netherlandish oil painting with Italian form, perspective, and architecture. A unique and beautiful hybrid, the series may well have called for collaboration, not only within the painter's workshop, but between different teams of artists employed at Urbino. For instance, between someone responsible for devising the overall perspective scheme and someone else responsible for implementing it. It's notable that the figures do not follow the same perspective as the thrones, and overall the orthogonals do not converge in a single vanishing point. Of course, you're looking here at only a fragment of the overall decoration, so I would just stress that the three that you see on the left-hand side of the screen are thought to have been the three that hung together or shared a perspective. So when I'm saying about this lack of a unified vanishing point, I'm really talking about those three. We don't know exactly what the companions of music would have been. In the corner of dialectic, here, sorry, my cursor's wiggling about. This is the area I am thinking about. There is a jarring conjunction of architectural elements and orthogonals that points to a lack of expertise in these fields, in contrast to the brilliantly foreshortened organ in music, which may be based on a design supplied by a different artist. Perhaps Francesco di Giorgio, who designed a similar organ in his own representation of music in the intarsia door of the Sala degli Angeli in the Ducal Palace. The thrones employ a classical vocabulary, but are highly eccentric in their combination of forms and choice of decoration, including Kufic-style script and gemstones. They are far from the Albertian purity of Federico's built environment and its decoration. By contrast, the all'antica script on the friezes is a reprise of that employed in the courtyard and studiolo. The whimsical vocabulary of the thrones has its closest equivalent in the slightly earlier series of muses painted for the Este Studiolo at Belfiore. Given that Ferrarese illuminators worked for Federico, the involvement of a Ferrarese designer cannot be ruled out. The Belfiore muses were painted by an equipe of independent artists from Ferrara, Siena, and Hungary, more mobile artists indeed. It is not impossible that a comparable approach was adopted at Urbino, where the eclectic nature of the liberal arts, including its freestyle handling of oil paint, could suggest a collaborative undertaking between artists expert in particular fields. The idea of an Urbino workshop, in inverted commas, officina urbinate, in which artists with diverse skills from different backgrounds collaborated on Federico's projects in the 1470s, has recently been evoked by Francesca Bottaccini. In this model, artists worked collaboratively and not necessarily subordinately to one another to realize works in a distinctive style that expressed Federico's tastes, combining his admiration for Netherlandish oil painting with his passion for architecture and perspective. Intentionally or not, the Urbino workshop constituted a kind of laboratory or crucible for the exchange and evolution of artistic ideas. Federico's admiration of art produced in other centres and his desire to combine the best of the architecture and decoration of his palace is well known. It would be remarkable if the diverse practitioners who came to Urbino, who included Florentine intarsiatori, Lombard and Florentine sculptors, architects from Dalmatia and Siena, did not exchange ideas. Into this crucible went the expert knowledge of Netherlandish techniques that Justus of Ghent brought with him, which enabled other painters who participated in the workshop, be it under his aegis or in his wake, to build on this expertise. They presumably included the painter or painters responsible for a small group of paintings stylistically and technically akin to the second Justus group, but in my view inferior in quality, which are invariably given to Berruguete, although surely Italian. The best is the Dead Christ with Two Angels in the Brera, which might be by one of the artists who participated in the liberal arts. The slightly pudgy hands of the angels and their facial types are not unlike those of music or astronomy, for instance. Probably by the same artist is the Saint Sebastian from the convent of Santa Chiara at Urbino, now in the Galleria Nazionale. Both works employ a thick, viscous oil paint. Pope Sixtus IV in Cleveland, which I confess I have not seen in person, which is based on the portrait of Sixtus from The Famous Man, looks crisper in execution and may be by a different painter. The workshop seems to have had no long-term legacy. and was probably dispersed after Federico's death in 1482. It seems fruitless in the current state of knowledge to try to assign identities to the painters of the Urbino workshop, but it is worth considering Justus's legacy for the artists who have at times been suggested as the third man. Donato Bramante, born around 1443, came from outside Urbino. Nothing is known about his training or early work, although he may well have acquired experience on projects at the palace. It has often been suggested that he contributed to the perspectival scheme and architectural designs of the famous men, but this is entirely speculative. It is not known when he left Urbino. He is first documented in 1477 in Bergamo, working on the painted facade of the Palazzo del Pretorio, now largely destroyed. Comprising figures of ancient philosophers in architectural niches viewed di sotto in su, this could well have been inspired by a memory of the famous men. The only figure generally agreed to be by Bramante himself, Chilon of Sparta, with shaggy hair and beard, book and fanciful hat, is generically like them. The famous men are also surely recalled in Bramante's later Heraclitus and Democritus from the Casa Panigarola in Milan, paired half-length figures with expressive hands, accompanied by books and other attributes, and like the famous men, viewed slightly from below. Melozzo da Forlì was once believed to be the author of the second Justus group. This is a long time ago, we're talking sort of 19th century. And although this has long been refuted, it is still suggested that he worked at Urbino in the 1470s. There is no evidence for this, but given his activity in the Romagna, the Marche and Rome, and his patronal connections, it is not implausible. In any event, he surely visited Urbino and saw works by Justus. Not previously noted, to my knowledge, is the impact of the Communion and the famous men on his frescoes in the sacristy of St. Mark at the Santa Casa di Loreto, datable to the early 80s. The distinctive types of the disciples in the Communion, with long faces, high foreheads, shaggy locks, and thick beards, are recalled in some of the disciples in the entry to Jerusalem, and also in some of the prophets in the vault. The famous men may have inspired the prophets' exotic headgear. For example, Zacharias's turban and David's crown, which recall Ptolemy's headdress. Melozzo's copious crumpled drapery folds, his use of deep tonalities and a wide chromatic range also seem inspired by the Communion, which in its original state, and it has been the victim of the most drastic cleaning in the 1930s, but in its original state, it must have been a visually compelling work, spatially ambitious, compositionally inventive, replete with virtuosic details such as gleaming metalwork and translucent glass. I mean, I think it must have blown viewers away when it was first unveiled in the 1470s. And as recent pigment analysis by Gianluca Poldi has shown, it employed varied pigments and striking color combinations. Justus's hovering angels may have suggested Melozzos with their naturalistic feathery wings and strong tonal contrast, which create an almost unearthly luminescence. The hairstyle of the angel with the olive branch above Zachariah is, I think, particularly reminiscent of Justus's angels. The artist who might reasonably be supposed to have interacted with Justus and his collaborators is the Urbinate painter Giovanni Santi. Yet suggestions that he was a member of Justus's workshop and even that he finished the Communion are purely speculative. The recent attribution to him of a half-length copy of Christ from the Communion doesn't alter this, as this could have been made to commission. In fact, for an artist working in an environment where Netherlandish painting was so admired, Santi was surprisingly unresponsive to Justus as a pictorial source, with the possible exception of the Apostles from Urbino Cathedral and the Muses from the so-called Tempietto delle Muse in the Ducal Palace, which may distantly reflect the Communion, music and rhetoric. Justus is also surprisingly absent from the list of distinguished artists in Santi's rhymed chronicle of the life and patronage of Federico, written between 1482 and 98, an omission that may suggest personal and or professional jealousy. There's no doubt that living in a small town and employed at court, they would have known each other. Santi, a keen exponent of oil painting, surely benefited from the practical knowledge disseminated by Justus, although his techniques seem closer to that of Italian practitioners such as Perugino than to either Justus or the Urbino workshop. His draperies appear to be painted in an oil-rich medium and exhibit drying defects in the thickly painted passages, as in the Annunciation from Santa Maria Maddalena at Senigallia, now in the Galleria Nazionale. His predilection for chromatic variety and unusual colour combinations, for instance in the lilacs, yellows and reds of the Fano Visitation, may have been inspired by the varied palette of the Communion. Revealingly, Santi was one of the first Italian painters widely to adopt the use of powdered glass, a practice in which he was followed by his son Raphael, and which can only have been gleaned from Justus's practice. Pending further scientific research and or a new documentary find, the questions surrounding Justus's activity in Urbino, whether he died or left after 1475, who were his collaborators or successors, whether he remained at the helm of the Urbino workshop, interacting with local practitioners to create works in a unique hybrid style, remain unanswerable. His legacy, however, often overshadowed by questions of attribution, deserves further consideration, beyond the core artists and works, which I focused on here, to others, such as this intriguing portrait of Guidobaldo, attributed to Bartolomeo della Gatta. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paula. We're traveling all across northern Italy. We've got to stay put in one city, but then we saw how the whole world came to the city, so, or at least much of the world. And speaking of traveling the world, we've heard a speaker from North America and a speaker from Europe, and now I'm pleased to introduce a speaker from Asia, specifically from Japan, Michiko Fukaya, who I had the pleasure of meeting last night. Some of us had dinner together, and we learned that a dozen years ago, she published a translation of Carl Vermander into Japanese. This is just indicative of her interest in Dutch painting. She's an associate professor at the Department of General Arts at Kyoto City University of Arts, and her research centers on 17th century Dutch painting, with a particular focus on the cultural interactions with the wider world. And she also explores the visual culture of the Dutch Republic in its European and global contexts, looking at both the artistic production and reception. So please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
So thank you so much for kind introduction. And I would like to thank Professor Ito and Professor Kwakkelstein for inviting me and giving me such a wonderful opportunities. And I appreciate greatly the kind help of the NIKI staffs. Thank you for all. And do you hear me right? Yeah, okay. Then let me begin. Italian Renaissance painters. No, sorry. I have to. Thank you. Italian Renaissance painters of the 15th century adopted the technique of oil painting along with surface textures and the landscape from Nederlands art. Some rulers even sent their court painters to the north to learn these techniques firsthand. The influence of Netherlandish painting on Italian art has long been a central theme of scholarship, with a substantial body of literature contributing to our knowledge today. It would be impossible to list all contributions, but foremost among them is a work of Paula Nuttal, who, as you know, had just given us a wonderful lecture. And my own research has usually focused on the 17th century Netherlandish painting, particularly in the Caravaggisti. Today, however, I venture into quite a different subject. My point of departure today will be Jan van Eyck's well-known St. Francis, a choice that I realize may raise some concerns. Yeah, it's too famous and
there's much to say.
yeah. I will examine its reception in the Veneto region and the strategies artists employed in adapting it, focusing in particular on Bartolomeo Montagna. First, let me outline the basic facts. Two versions of St. Francis receiving the stigmata by or attributed to Jan van Eyck in Turin and Philadelphia. These two paintings have been linked to the will of Anselm Adonis, a wealthy merchant from Bruges of Genoese origin, who undertook a pilgrimage to Jerusalem between 1470 and 1471. In the will, drawn up before his departure, it stated that each of his two daughters should receive a painting by Jan van Eyck and on which St. Francis is portrayed. Although the will survived only in a 16th century transcript, it's striking for the congruence between the number and subject matter in the document and existing works. Moreover, it was just around the time of Adonis' journey through Italy that many Italian paintings began to show borrowings from and the influence of Van Eyck's St. Francis. In Florence, for example, Botticelli and Filippino Lippi's Adoration of Magi features an almost verbatim borrowing from Jan van Eyck's work in the background. We can recognize the form of the rocks, the water with a boat in the city. The rock on the far left also seems to echo the form of the left-hand rock in St. Francis. Another famous example is Verrocchio and Leonardo's Baptism of Christ, where a part of the landscape and the rock behind St. John the Baptist resemble the one in Van Eyck's paintings. Regarding the Florentine examples, scholars have already accumulated substantial findings, and there is little for me to add. On his return journey, Adonis also stayed in Venice from 18th February to 6th March 1471. The fact has been related to the landscape depiction in Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis to varying degrees. For example, Ruthergren and Hale argued that, I quote, Bellini's conception of the sheer precipice may also have been influenced by a diminutive painting of St. Francis by Jan van Eyck, end quote, while Gasparotto notes that some of Bellini's works, including St. Francis, are, quote, inconceivable without Van Eyck's St. Francis. Let us briefly compare the works. Unlike the Florentine examples we have seen, where the borrowing and reference are rather obvious, Bellini's St. Francis doesn't appear to have been influenced by Van Eyck in such a direct manner. They do, however, share certain elements. An impressively layered rock mass in the right foreground, a distant view of a city, blue mountains against the sky turning white near the horizon, and a meticulous naturalism. It should be noted here that it has been suggested that they may have visited the site of St. Francis' stigmatization, Mount La Berna or Bernia. Although this view is completely speculative, the rock cliff of La Berna shows a strong resemblance to the rock masses they painted. In that case, the closeness between Bellini and Van Eyck could be explained not by direct reference, but by a kind of parallelism caused by the same real site. St. Francis is an Italian artist, Italian saint, and the sites connected to his life could be visited. In addition, nature and the wilderness play an important role in his legend. The late 14th century Considerazioni sulle stimate di San Francesco and his life in the Golden Legend include many passages referring to the stones and rocks in magnificent nature. Giant rocks appear in his story not only as a stage or background, but sometimes also as agent, gently receiving and saving him when demons make him fall from the sky. Therefore, rock masses are often emphasized in the depiction of the saint, for example, in this work by Marco Zoppo. During this period, however, interest in topographically accurate depictions was growing. It would be no wonder if artists or patrons became interested in the appearance of the rocks and landscapes that the saint admired. However, Bellini's other paintings from this period began to show a significant change in the depiction of rocks compared to his earlier works. The St. Francis has been dated around 1476 to 78, based on stylistic similarities with Bellini's Resurrection and Transfiguration, both securely dated by older records. Take, for example, his Agony in the Garden from around 1460. The atmosphere of the landscape matches Christ's agony and solitude. Here, the depictions of rocks are clearly indebted to Mantegna. Stones split into block-like square shapes, wrinkled and curling rock masses that suggest plasticity or even viscosity, and a distant mountain with a faint hint of medieval spiral-shaped formations, like this one. By contrast, the works from after mid-1470s feature a new type of rock. His Saint Jerome in the Desert, for example, includes protruding stratification, the horizontal layering, typical of Van Eyck's St. Francis, and along with a more complex chipping of the cliff around here and here. Similar observations can be made in his Resurrection, though some Mantegnesque characteristics still remain in his work. Looking at both works again, there is a clear affinity between the two St. Francis panels. The formation of the rock masses, the stratification, the chipped and eroded surfaces, the highly realistic details, and the sense of diffused light. The small white flowers scattered among the grass atop the cliff provide another common feature, suggesting a saint's blessed relationship with nature. As already mentioned, Adonis stayed in Venice for more than 2 weeks, during which he enjoyed the hospitality of local notables. His son recorded the names of Lorenzo Bembo, Giovanni Brigandini, a doctor named Antonio, and Lorenzo Contarini. Unfortunately, the backgrounds of family trees of these individuals haven't been identified. Yet the family names Bembo and Contarini are intriguing. Benedetto Bembo, as is well known, owned Florence paintings and once acted as Bellini's representative in correspondence with Isabella d'Este, while Taddeo Contarini owned Bellini's St. Francis when Marcantonio Michiel saw it in his collection in 1525. Considering the circumstances, leading local painters such as the Bellinis could well have had the opportunity to view Van Eyck's panels, if indeed Adonis carried it with him on his pilgrimage. Of course, our information about northern paintings in Italy at the time is limited, and it's possible that similar visual sources arrived through other routes than Adonis' journey. Nevertheless, the works that indicate knowledge of Van Eyck's St. Francis seem to have been produced around Venice from around this same period. In this context, I would like to draw attention to works of Bartolomeo Montagna. He was possibly trained in Venice, as his works show knowledge of Bellini, Vivarini, and Antonello da Messina, but he established his career mainly in Vicenza. He was also active in Venice, where he received his first public commission in 1482. Documentary evidence records him in Venice in January 1469 and in Vicenza in August 1474. Although the exact date of his return to Vicenza is not known, It seems possible that he was in Venice when Adonis visited the city. It seems that Montaigne drew on visual information from Van Eyck's St. Francis, however he may have obtained it. His Virgin and a Child with a Saint in Liverpool provides an example. At first glance, the landscape may appear generic rather than a direct borrowing or adaptation, yet it contains clearly Achaean details. A winding road into the woods, reflective water with a small crescent-shaped boat, a cityscape with blue and orange rooftops, and hazy blue mountains in the distance. By transforming the original into a new composition, Montaigne made the reference less apparent, but we can still sense the Achaean prototype beneath his landscape. Generally speaking, Montaigne's landscape owed much to Bellini, but these particular details cannot be found in Bellini's work, at least not in this combination. So in this case, Bellini alone cannot have sufficed, as Montaigne shows. Let us take another example. This Sacra Conversazione, commissioned around 1485, reveals multiple references or traces of study from Bellini's works. The setting of a massive rock, a pergola made with natural trees supporting a red cloth, and a strong sense of cast shadow. Around here. Betray his knowledge of Bellini's St. Francis. At the same time, the tonal palette of the picture, the clay-like white slab in the foreground, and its contrast with the ragged angular stone wall recall Bellini's Transfiguration, painted for none other than Vicenza. On the other hand, Montaigne emphasizes a certain element more strongly than Bellini: the rock's dents and cavities. Yes. You can see here many cavities and holes in the rocks, these features. It was surely these meticulous details that led Boschini to praise the work as bellissimo paese fatto con somma diligenza, and they are closer to Van Eyck's rocks than to Bellini's. Curiously, Roberto Longhi once described these cavities and holes as in the country of clay with fossil imprints. We cannot say whether Montaigne intended them as fossils, but scholars have pointed out that the rocks in Van Eyck's St. Francis contain fossil-like forms. Shell fossils are discernible in the limestone boulders near Brother Leo, here and here. And the strange-shaped cavities to the right of his head may indicate sites of weathered outer illusions, either fossil fragments or carbonate nodules, in Kenneth Baird's words. And he's published a geological approach to this painting. In this way, while Montaigne clearly owed much to Bellini's new type of landscape, he also emphasized meticulous descriptive elements even further. This must have served as a strategy of differentiation or as an added value in his paintings. Take also his Saint Jerome in the Desert, which must have resulted from his study of Bellini's work on the same subject. Bellini's prototype is discernible in the arrangement of multiple planes layered toward the background and in the choice of motifs. At the same time, however, Montaigne's smaller work features a distant view, which is typically Achaean, as in his Liverpool Madonna. Of course, Montaigne also responded to a variety of contemporary influences beyond Bellini and Van Eyck, thereby diversifying his art. It may be assumed, however, that he had a keen understanding of Bellini's landscapes, was quick to incorporate their qualities into his own work, and when possible, skillfully introduced elements from the rarer and highly celebrated works of Jan van Eyck. In the competitive climate of the Renaissance, when many painters strove to create new and superior expressions, Netherlandish painting was likely an effective means of this differentiation. Lastly, let us examine a painting that could likewise be regarded as a result of a differentiation strategy employing Netherlandish landscape. This is a landscape with castles in the National Museum Western Art, Tokyo. Earlier attributions included names such as Piero di Cosimo and Vittore Carpaccio, but Everett Fay and Lionel Puppi considered it a work by Bartolomeo Montagna. In Mauro Lupo's most recent catalog, Raisonneur Montagna, however, the painting is placed among the rejected works and attributed instead to the Maestro del Trittico di San Niccolò a Padova. I am not in a position to propose an attribution for this painter, but the working method or strategy evident in this painting seems closer to that of Bartolomeo Montagna. In comparing it with Montagna's accepted works, the background landscape of the Strasbourg Holy Family seems to offer the closest style to that of Tokyo Tondo. Also rejecting the attribution to Montagna, Lupo nevertheless acknowledged the work's indebtedness to Bellini's art and its Venetian origin. Comparing it to Bellini's St. Francis, one notices resemblances in the diagonal composition and in the degree of naturalism. This parallel diagonal line is closer. And the work is also reminiscent of Bellini's Sacred Allegory. It may appear somewhat far-fetched at a first glance, but a watercolor drawing attributed to Marco Bassaiti, in which the rocks on a small peninsula in Bellini's work are transformed into more jagged and sharp ones, seem to bridge these two works. Bellini was capable of allowing the landscape to speak for itself, and his landscapes carry a special potential, at once realistic and mystical, suitable as a stage for divine stories. The painter of the Tokyo Tondo seems to have sought the same orientation, letting the landscape exist on its own without human protagonists in the foreground. In doing so, the painter owed not only Bellini, but also to the Netherlands landscape. The rippling water in the foreground, the imposing rock mass with many cracks and fissures, the reflecting water, the winding road climbing the slope, the distant buildings, the jagged rocky ridges, and the hazy blue mountains on the horizon, all these are components inherent in Van Eyck's St. Francis. Seen in this light, the painter of the Tondo appears to have pursued a strategy similar to Montagna's, making his work both attractively familiar and moderately innovative. Furthermore, the artist may have introduced some newer elements into his composition. Although this matter requires further research, I would like to offer a couple of observations. One of these concerns the castles on the cliff, which are characterized as uninhabitable and inconsistent with a credible orography. These are Luco's words. The other is a depiction of scattered shells in the foreground. They were also common motifs in Netherlandish painting. Where these shells placed near the rocks recall Van Eyck's fossilized shells, they were also common motifs in Netherlandish painting, particularly in depictions of St. John the Evangelist on Patmos. Beginning in the first decades of the 16th century, however, the combination of shells, rocks, and fantastical castles on cliff started to appear in the works of northern artists such as Hérimet de Blesse and Lucas Hassel. It's therefore possible that the painter of the Tokyo Tondo looked at such details, drawing on these examples as a new means to differentiate and enrich his composition. In this context, the presence of a St. Catherine by Joachim Patinil in the Grimani collection in Venice in 1521 may be particularly significant, even though we cannot be certain that the painting now in Vienna is identical with the one recorded in the Grimani collection. Van Eyck's landscape must have offered a wealth of details of a new to Italian painting in the 15th century. But this tomba, possibly painted in or after 1520s, might also have drawn upon other rare and more recent northern sources that came to reach Italy. It's difficult to say whether Montaigne himself could have achieved this before his death in 1523. In any case, the details of landscapes, especially those imported from northern paintings as novelties, were of great interest to Italian Renaissance painters, serving as strategies for adding fresh accents to their own works and differentiating them from their principal local models. That means Mantegna for Bellini and Bellini for Montaigne. The urge for renewal and differentiation can be observed in the rapid and diverse development in rock depiction from the 1460s onward. Rocks are omnipresent and often overlooked, but these details may tell us much about the reception and adaptation of northern landscape in Renaissance Italy. That's the idea I wish to share with you today. I'm still reflecting on it, so I would greatly appreciate your candid feedback. Thank you.